If I hadn't ripped the lock off that gate with my pickup truck, our whole town might have burned down. That sentence still echoes in my head, especially now that I'm standing here, watching a fire truck refill its tank from the emergency water valve buried just inside my property line, the one Karen tried to claim as her own. The same one she padlocked shut because, and I quote, "Your gate clashes with the neighborhood's visual consistency." I wish I were joking. But nope, Karen's HOA reign of terror turned into a full-blown, statewide emergency in under 24 hours. And it all started with a silver padlock, a folding lawn chair, and one woman's absolute inability to mind her own business. It was just another Monday morning. Birds chirping, coffee brewing, my dog Ripley doing his usual patrol of the fence line, like he's guarding Fort Knox. I was halfway through replacing some boards on the chicken coop when I saw her, Karen, marching down the gravel road with purpose. She was wearing those oversized sunglasses that make people look like anime villains, holding a clipboard like it was the sword of righteousness. I didn't think much of it until I noticed she was walking straight toward my gate. She paused, looked around, pulled something shiny from her purse, and before I could even get close enough to shout, she snapped a padlock onto my front gate and turned on her heel like she'd just planted a flag on the moon. I jogged up, dust flying from my boots, trying to stay calm. "Hey, did you just lock my gate?" I called out. She didn't even flinch. "Yes, I did. Per HOA Ordinance 14B, no unapproved front-facing structures may remain unlocked." "Karen," I said, already regretting using her name, "this isn't a front-facing structure. It's a private access gate on a private easement." She smiled like I'd just told her I didn't believe in air. "That's what you think. But it's clearly visible from the community trail. It's an eyesore. I've submitted multiple complaints and taken the liberty of securing it myself." I stared at her, utterly baffled. "You submitted complaints about my gate?" She nodded like a teacher who was proud her student had finally caught up. 3. All unaddressed. So I acted. The thing is, I could have taken the lock off right then and there. I could have pulled out bolt cutters or yanked it loose with my ATV. But I didn't. Not because I was afraid of her. Karen's got the body mass of a broomstick and the legal authority of a yard gnome, but because I knew exactly what was under that patch of gravel behind the gate. 10 feet in, buried beneath a metal hatch, was the emergency valve to the town's backup water supply, installed after the 2017 flood wiped out the mainline infrastructure. And guess who the county contracted to help design and install that system? Yours truly. I looked down at the lock, then back up at Karen, who was already typing something into her phone. "I've documented your noncompliance," she chirped, completely unaware that she'd just blocked off the single access point the fire department had used 3 summers in a row during fire season. But it didn't stop there. No. Karen unfolded her lawn chair, plopped it down on her own property right across from my gate, and spent the next 4 hours drinking kombucha and glaring at anyone who came near it, including the Amazon delivery guy. I watched from my porch, stunned, as she actually tried to redirect him to the back alley entrance, which doesn't exist. By sunset, the temperature had spiked to 103 degrees, and the fire warnings were already flashing on the local news. I debated calling the fire department to give them a heads-up about the gate situation, but I figured it'd blow over in a day. Worst-case scenario, she'd get bored and leave. Right? Wrong. That night, lightning struck a ridge 4 miles east. Dry brush went up like gasoline-soaked confetti. I could see the orange glow from my upstairs window before I even smelled the smoke. I flipped on my phone and checked the fire map. The wind was pushing the flames west, straight toward our town. Within 30 minutes, I heard the sirens. Fire trucks roared down the community trail, headed straight for my gate. I grabbed my boots and sprinted out, hoping someone had thought to bring bolt cutters. But no. When I got there, Karen was still in her lawn chair, now in a bathrobe, sipping from a stemless wine glass like she was at a spa. One of the firefighters jumped out and ran up to the gate. We need access to the valve now. Karen didn't even look up. This is private property. I can't allow anyone through without HOA clearance. I blinked. The firefighter blinked. Everyone blinked. Ma'am, he said, trying to stay professional, that water access is registered as an emergency infrastructure asset. You're obstructing state response. Karen waved her hand like she was brushing off a fly. Then bring paperwork. I didn't wait. I turned, jogged back to my shed, grabbed a chain, hooked it to the lock, tied the other end to my pickup, and floored it. The sound of the metal snapping was the most satisfying thing I'd heard in years. The gate flew open like the jaws of life, and the truck rolled in. Karen screamed something about legal action, but nobody cared. A firefighter tossed her a warning pamphlet and told her to sit down. The fire was contained within hours, thanks to the emergency water supply. But one house, up in the foothills, was lost before they could get to it. I spent the next day giving a statement to a very tense group of county officials. Karen? She was nowhere to be found. But her lock? I hung it on my porch with a sign that read, "Warning, may cause wildfires." And that was just the beginning. Because once the town realized who'd locked the gate, and why, it was like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion. And guess what? Karen had built that house herself. The day after the fire, our sleepy little town felt like it had woken up with a hangover. Smoke still clung to the trees like a bad memory, and the air had that scorched earth smell that made everyone's nerves just a little raw. I figured I'd get maybe a few awkward nods at the diner or a thumbs up from the fire crew, but what I walked into that morning felt more like a press conference. As soon as I stepped through the door of Rosie's cafe, the place went dead silent. Every head turned. Old men paused mid-bite, kids stopped spinning on stools, and Rosie herself set down her coffee pot like it had offended her. "You the guy with the gate?" someone called from the back. I gave a slow nod, still trying to process the attention. Yeah. Didn't realize locking a gate would become a town-wide scandal. An older woman near the counter crossed her arms. It wouldn't have been, if that woman hadn't padlocked the only access to our emergency water system. My brother's house nearly went up. From behind the register, Rosie piped up. "You know Karen filed a complaint against you this morning? Claimed you damaged HOA property when you broke the lock. Sheriff already tossed it in the trash, but thought you should know." That got a few chuckles. A man in overalls leaned over and whispered, "She's been calling herself waterfront coordinator. Told my wife she had the authority to inspect our garden hose for noncompliance." I sat down, more amused than angry. So she's been busy. That was putting it mildly. Over the next few hours, I learned Karen hadn't just padlocked my gate, she'd been on a one-woman crusade to improve the neighborhood. That included sending violation notices for untrimmed hedges, unauthorized lawn furniture, and even a kid's basketball hoop that posed an aesthetic hazard. People were livid, but no one wanted to cross her. Apparently, she'd filed more official complaints in 3 months than the entire HOA board had in the past 5 years. But that fire changed things. Everyone was talking now, and by lunchtime, word had spread that the town council would be holding an emergency meeting. I got a call from Councilman Devers personally inviting me to speak. His exact words were, "You're the only one who knows what that gate's really for. We need to set the record straight before she rewrites the narrative with glitter and passive-aggressive signage." So I showed up to town hall that evening wearing a clean shirt, carrying a rolled-up blueprint of the underground water network, and holding a folder of every signed contract and infrastructure diagram I'd been a part of since 2017. The room was packed. People lined the walls, sat on the floor, even stood out in the hallway. And right there in the front row, in a pristine white pantsuit and a smug little smile, sat Karen. Clipboard in hand. Mayor Schultz opened the meeting with a simple question. "Can someone explain what happened at Gate E17 during yesterday's fire response?" I stood up and laid the blueprint across the council table. Gate E17 isn't just a gate. It's the only accessible route for emergency responders to reach the reserve water main beneath Ridgeview. This isn't speculation. It's codified in the town's emergency response plan and tied directly to the fire department's GPS routing system. Karen immediately raised her hand. Excuse me, but I was under the impression that gate was part of private property. If so, it should adhere to the aesthetic and security requirements laid out in the HOA charter. The mayor sighed. Mrs. Travers, you'll have a chance to speak after Mr. Miller finishes. I turned to her. You're right about one thing, it is private property. Mine. And it's also federally designated as a secondary access corridor for emergency utilities, which overrides any local or private governance, including the HOA. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone muttered, "Federal?" Seriously? Karen didn't blink. And yet, that information wasn't made readily available to homeowners. As waterfront coordinator, I simply did what I thought was best to maintain safety and visual harmony. Devers jumped in. Visual harmony? The fire crews had to drive 17 miles around a mountain to get access. One home was lost. Are you calling that harmonious? Karen pressed her lips into a thin line. No one notified me of any emergency use plans. Perhaps the town should have communicated better. That's when I dropped the big one. The county did notify the HOA. In 2018, there's an email trail showing the then board acknowledged the easement, signed off on the emergency overlay, and agreed to maintain unobstructed access in perpetuity. I have the documents right here. I handed them to Devers, who passed them down the line like they were radioactive. Karen's face paled as she tried to peek over someone's shoulder. But it got worse. I'd brought one more item. A copy of the inspection report showing that the valve system had been upgraded in 2021 with federal grant money, making it a Homeland Security asset under regional infrastructure protection. And yes, I explained, blocking it was not just a violation of local codes, but a potential felony. Karen tried to interrupt again, but the mayor cut her off. Enough. We've heard quite enough. The fact that this infrastructure wasn't common knowledge doesn't justify your actions, and the consequences speak for themselves. We'll be reviewing potential civil liability for obstruction and evaluating the HOA's responsibility in this matter. The room broke into applause. Someone shouted, "About time." As I sat down, Karen quietly packed her clipboard into a giant floral tote bag and stormed out. For a second, I thought that would be the end of it. But I underestimated just how deep Karen had wormed herself into the HOA. Because less than 24 hours later, I received a notice on my porch, signed by the HOA board, that I was being fined $800 for unauthorized demolition of HOA-installed hardware and vehicular misuse on shared land. They'd actually tried to fine me for saving the town. That's when I realized, this wasn't over. Not even close. Karen might have lost the battle at town hall, but she'd just declared war through paperwork. And unfortunately for her, I had more than tools and blueprints on my side. I had the law. And I was just getting warmed up. By the next morning, my mailbox looked like it had been personally targeted by a legal paper blizzard. 4 separate envelopes, all stamped with HOA insignias, were crammed into the slot, each one thicker and more pompous than the last. I opened them at my kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee and the calm resolve of someone who had absolutely no intention of paying a single dime. The first was a fine. The second was a cease and desist claiming I had destroyed association property. The third accused me of creating an unsafe precedent for community response behavior. And the fourth? A demand to appear before the HOA's Emergency Conduct Review Panel. Whatever that was, they were doubling down. Even after being publicly shamed, even after town hall, Karen and her clipboard mafia were trying to swing the narrative back in their favor. And unfortunately, that HOA board? Most of them were either too checked out or too intimidated to push back. Karen had been slowly replacing members with people who owed her favors or didn't want to get tangled in her drama. I realized then that this wasn't just pettiness. This was strategy. And it had been happening for months. I called my buddy Darren, a local paralegal who owed me a favor after I helped him install a greywater system in his cabin last summer. He answered on the first ring. "Let me guess," he said. "Karen. Like a cockroach in a power suit." He chuckled. "You bring the files, I'll bring the popcorn." An hour later, we were in his office, papers spread out like we were planning a heist. Darren was flipping through Karen's complaint while sipping from a mug that said I read contracts for fun. His eyebrows climbed higher with every page. Wow. She's not just reaching, she's pole vaulting into nonsense. Look at this section. She's citing HOA code from the 1980s. Half this stuff isn't even enforceable anymore. Can we hit back? Oh, absolutely. And we're going to start with this. He pulled up a scanned PDF on his screen. The original easement agreement from 2017. Signed by the previous HOA president. It's still active. And this part right here. Perpetual emergency access shall not be obstructed or regulated by private associations or individuals. That's gold. So we sue. Not yet. We go one better. He clicked a few more times and pulled up a map of our county's emergency infrastructure zones. Turns out, my gate wasn't just important, it was flagged in the county registry as a critical access point tied to FEMA-funded upgrade, which meant blocking it wasn't just a code violation. It was a federal violation. I stared at the screen, slowly grinning. So Karen accidentally committed a felony? Darren nodded. And if she filed that lock as an HOA improvement? Then the entire board just implicated themselves in obstructing a federal utility. We're talking Homeland Security level consequences. And that's when things took a wild left turn. Darren reached into his drawer, pulled out a flash drive and said, "You're gonna want to see this." He plugged it into his laptop and opened a folder labeled HOA Watchdog. On the screen appeared a long thread of screenshots, emails, group chats, and internal messages from the HOA board's private communications platform. One stood out immediately. Karen, in full digital glory, typing, "We locked it. He can't prove it's a federal easement, and even if he tries, it'll take months. By then, he'll either cave or rack up so many fines he'll beg to comply." Another said, "Don't worry, I've got Jenkins on my side. He owes me for getting that patio variance approved. He'll rubber stamp whatever I need." I leaned back, whistling. She's not just entitled, she's playing Game of Thrones with lawn chairs. Darren laughed. That's a quote for the ages. Armed with the emails, the easement documents, and the FEMA registration codes, we filed a formal complaint with the county zoning office. Then we submitted a report to the Regional Infrastructure Authority. By the end of the day, I had confirmation that both departments had opened investigations. But the cherry on top? The fire marshal himself called me that evening. I'd sent him the same files, just in case. He said, "Jordan, I've got news. We're referring this to the State Emergency Oversight Committee. This is bigger than we thought." Are we talking criminal? Potentially. At the very least, obstruction of critical infrastructure during an active emergency. You might want to stay out of her way for a bit. Too late for that, though. Because that night, I got a knock at my door. It was Karen. No clipboard this time. Just a smug, squinty expression and a stack of glossy folders tucked under one arm. "I'm here to discuss your behavior," she said without so much as a hello. I leaned on the doorframe. "Karen, you do realize you're currently under investigation by 3 government departments, right?" Her smile didn't falter. "You're bluffing." "Nope. And I have your emails. The ones where you brag about locking the gate." Her eyes twitched. Just a fraction. Then she straightened her spine and tossed a folder at my feet. "That's your official summons to the HOA disciplinary hearing. Refusal to attend will result in escalated fines." I picked it up, opened it, and laughed. "You scheduled this for Thursday?" "Yes." "Good timing. That's the same day you're getting served." and I shut the door. The next morning, I watched from my porch as 2 county officials marched up to Karen's house with a file in hand and very serious expressions. She answered in a pink bathrobe, clearly unprepared. I didn't hear what they said, but the look on her face? Worth every headache she'd ever caused. I thought that would be the end of it. That once the government got involved, she'd back off, maybe disappear quietly and lick her wounds in whatever HOA cave she crawled out of. But no. Because 2 hours later, my phone pinged with a new email. The subject line read, HOA Board proposes temporary suspension of easement agreement pending legal clarification. Karen wasn't backing down. She was escalating. When I opened that email and saw the subject line claiming the HOA was proposing to suspend the easement agreement, I nearly dropped my phone into my coffee. It was one of those moments where reality bends around your sense of logic, and you think, surely, no one is this bold. But Karen was. If there was a mountain of reason, she'd scale it just to plant her flag of pettiness at the top. I scrolled through the email and felt my blood pressure rise with every sentence. It was stuffed with legal-sounding gibberish, clearly written to confuse anyone who didn't have experience with municipal codes. Phrases like pending clarification of jurisdictional boundaries and temporary access reassessment procedures danced across the screen like a bureaucratic ballet choreographed by someone who thought a locked gate was a hill worth dying on. The kicker was that the board had unanimously voted to consider halting the access easement while their legal team reviewed implications. I knew full well Karen didn't have a legal team. She probably had a cousin who'd once won an argument on Facebook. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that the email had gone out to every homeowner in the HOA, and to the casual reader, it sounded legitimate. Dangerous, even. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't about how Karen blocked access to a life-saving water valve. Now she was spinning it as if the town had somehow overstepped, and that I was colluding with outside agencies to violate HOA sovereignty. Sovereignty. She actually used that word. Like she was the president of a rogue nation and I had sent troops into her backyard. I called Darren. He answered with a groggy voice, clearly having not seen the email yet. Check your inbox, I said. 30 seconds later, he muttered, Oh, hell no. Exactly. We knew we had to get ahead of this before it turned into an HOA echo chamber of misinformation. Luckily, we didn't have to act alone. The county inspector who'd visited Karen's property the day before had apparently been just as alarmed by her defiance. He'd already flagged the HOA's attempt to suspend the easement with the county legal department, and in a twist that made my entire week, he told me the Regional Infrastructure Authority had escalated the case to the state's Office of Emergency Management. That meant Karen had officially gotten the attention of people who use words like enforcement and injunction without blinking. But before the hammer dropped, something else happened. Something even better. The news vans arrived. I was outside fixing my fence when the first one pulled up. Channel 5, then Channel 9, then a local radio station's crew with mics and cameras buzzing with anticipation. Apparently someone, maybe someone who loved blueprints and drama, had leaked the internal HOA emails to the press. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Local HOA president blocks emergency access during fire, claims she has authority to override county infrastructure. It was beautiful. The footage from the town hall meeting played in a loop, showing Karen's smug face insisting the gate was private and the fire crew's reaction when they found it locked. Social media took over from there. Memes sprouted like weeds. One showed Karen's face photoshopped onto a medieval castle gate, captioned, "None shall pass unless HOA approved." Another had her lawn chair set on fire while firefighters stood helplessly on the other side of a locked gate. By noon, Karen did what she always did when the attention turned against her. She went live. There she was, sitting in her manicured backyard, carefully framed to show her flower beds and a tasteful outdoor fountain, holding a wine glass and speaking in the soft, righteous voice of someone trying to gaslight a town. I only did what I believed was necessary to preserve the integrity and safety of our neighborhood. At no point was I informed of the gate's critical status, and had I known, I would have, of course, taken different actions. The media is twisting facts and creating a false narrative. I'm not the villain here. I'm a concerned citizen. I nearly choked on my sandwich. Rosie from the cafe sent me a clip an hour later with the caption, "She just said the gate was a community hazard." Karen's damage control did the opposite. It enraged people. Homeowners who had sat quietly through her endless rule changes now saw the consequences of her power grab. A woman named Denise, who I'd never met, organized a petition to remove Karen from the HOA board. It gained over 200 signatures in less than 6 hours. Meanwhile, the state fire marshal held a press conference. I watched from my living room as he stood at a podium and said the words I'd been waiting to hear. "We are officially classifying the obstruction of access to the Ridgeview emergency valve as a breach of state emergency response protocols. We have launched a full investigation into the actions taken by local homeowners associations that may have contributed to delays during the recent wildfire event." Behind him, a large graphic showed a bright red arrow pointing directly at Karen's property. The next morning, I got a notice from the HOA. This time, it wasn't a fine. It was a letter acknowledging the situation and stating that the board had agreed to reconsider the temporary suspension of the easement due to newly revealed information. It was worded so carefully it practically tiptoed across the page, but the meaning was clear. They were backpedaling. But I wasn't finished. I submitted a bylaw challenge, using an obscure clause that allowed homeowners to call for an emergency vote to replace any board member who posed demonstrable harm to the community's safety or reputation. The clause hadn't been used in over 20 years, but it was still active. With Darren's help, I gathered enough signatures within 2 days. The vote was scheduled for the following week. The cherry on top? I found another buried regulation, tucked deep in the HOA charter, stating that any homeowner who obstructs emergency service access could be barred from holding board positions indefinitely. Karen was so focused on creating rules for flower heights and mailbox paint colors that she forgot to read the parts that actually mattered. That Saturday, I stood in front of a crowd of homeowners and firefighters, media and council members, and laid out the entire story. The gate, the fire, the emails, the lock. I didn't need to exaggerate anything, the facts were damning enough. When the vote came, it wasn't even close. Karen was removed. As I stood near the now unlocked gate that had caused so much chaos, I saw her walking away from the HOA office, flanked by a few stunned allies, her clipboard hanging limply at her side. She didn't look angry. She looked lost. Like someone who couldn't quite understand how her need for control had detonated in her face. And I'll be honest, part of me felt sorry for her. But only a very small part. Because the rest of me was already planning the new emergency gate protocol, with a smart lock override and 24/7 fire department access. No more padlocks. No more lawn chairs. And definitely no more Karen. The week after Karen was officially removed from the HOA board felt like breathing fresh air after months of holding your breath. For the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt normal. People were chatting across driveways again. Kids were playing in the cul-de-sac without being told to move their bike. No one was taping anonymous warnings to mailboxes or getting cited for the crime of owning wind chimes. It was as if a cloud had lifted and sunlight was finally reaching the sidewalks again. But even with her gone, Karen's presence lingered like the faint smell of burnt toast, harmless but unmistakably there. The board moved fast after the vote. A new interim president was appointed, an older gentleman named Mike who had the calm demeanor of a retired ship captain and absolutely no patience for nonsense. He and I met at the gate a few days later to finalize the new setup. The fire department had already sent a crew out to install a digital override system with secure access codes tied directly to dispatch. The smart gate now opened automatically for emergency vehicles with a remote signal. Karen's padlock was gone, replaced by technology she wouldn't have even understood, and to be honest, it felt poetic. But the real surprise came when Mike handed me a copy of the final settlement terms the HOA had agreed to. They weren't just dropping the fines and complaints. They were reimbursing me for damages to my property, issuing a formal apology to the county emergency office, and covering the cost of the gate upgrade out of the HOA's reserve fund. That last part probably stung for the board, but it was necessary. Karen's reign had drained not just patience, but credibility, and the HOA needed to earn back some trust. Still, I wasn't expecting what came next. During a routine safety drill organized by the fire department, they invited local residents to observe how the new gate access worked. I figured it would be a few chairs, a clipboard, and some guy with a whistle. But no, this was a full-blown event. Fire trucks rolled in, paramedics ran drills, and volunteers handed out snow cones to kids. It felt more like a block party than an emergency prep session. At some point during the drill, one of the firefighters pulled me aside and handed me a small plaque that read, "Community Safety Guardian." I didn't know what to say. I just laughed and said, "Does this come with a siren?" They all laughed too. And then someone showed up no one expected, Karen. She walked up the road in a wide-brimmed hat and large sunglasses, looking like someone trying to sneak into her own scandal. A few people spotted her and whispered, but no one said anything. She didn't carry a clipboard, and for once, she didn't say a word. She just stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the fire crews demonstrate how the new system worked. I wondered, for a moment, if the weight of everything she'd caused had finally sunk in. There was no grand speech, no tantrum, no attempt to reclaim her authority. She just stood there, quiet, until eventually she turned and walked away. That could have been the end of it, and honestly, I would have been fine with that. But fate, being the mischievous little thing it is, decided Karen still had one more act to perform. A week later, I received a notice from the HOA, an invitation, technically. It read, "You have been nominated as a candidate for Community Safety Liaison, a non-voting advisory role to the board." I had to laugh. After all the drama, after the legal back and forth, now they wanted me to be part of the team. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized maybe that was the point. Maybe the best way to keep a Karen from rising again was to make sure there was someone on the inside who actually cared about doing things right. I accepted. The first meeting was a trip. Sitting at the long HOA table, without the usual threats of fines or power grabs, felt surreal. Mike chaired the meeting with calm efficiency, and the new board members, people who had voted against Karen's tactics, actually listened. We reviewed new safety protocols, updated emergency plans, and voted to install fire-safe landscaping around common areas. There were no dramatic outbursts, no snide remarks about someone's paint color or patio furniture. Just progress. Afterward, a few neighbors came up to thank me, and I realized something else. People remembered. They remembered the fire. They remembered the delay. They remembered the sound of sirens stopped at a locked gate. That memory had changed how they saw the HOA. They were no longer afraid to speak up. They knew now that even the most polished clipboard couldn't override common sense and basic decency. Still, the town wasn't quite done getting its closure. A month after the fire, the county organized a public appreciation event for first responders and key community contributors. It wasn't fancy. Just a stage in the park, a few rows of chairs, and a bunch of people in folding t-shirts and lawn chairs, but it meant something. When my name was called and I stepped onto the stage, I wasn't sure what to expect. I'm not big on speeches, and I definitely didn't feel like a hero. But I looked out at the crowd, saw familiar faces, and thought about what that gate represented. It wasn't just metal and bolt. It was a symbol of access, of protection, and of what happens when someone values their authority over everyone else's safety. So I said something simple. I said, "One lock can stop water. One voice can stop that lock. So speak up, even if your voice is the first one." They clapped. I stepped down. And that was that. Life returned to normal. Mostly. Karen kept a low profile. I saw her occasionally walking her little dog with a leash that matched her sunglasses, but she never made eye contact. Rumor had it she was still trying to form a private neighborhood improvement committee, but it hadn't gone anywhere. Turns out, once people know what someone's capable of, they stop handing over keys. Literal or figurative. As for me, I got a little more involved in town stuff. Helped with the next fire drill. Worked on a water conservation campaign. Even consulted on a plan to add a second emergency valve. One with direct road access and zero proximity to any HOA property. Just in case. But the original gate still stands, smart lock blinking softly, a quiet reminder of how close we came to disaster. Sometimes, when I pass it on my way out, I glance at the small scratch left by Karen's padlock and smile. Because that scratch, annoying as it is, tells a whole story. About entitlement, resistance, fire, and community. About how one petty decision nearly turned into tragedy. And about how one man, one truck, and one broken padlock made sure it didn't.